Could I get the lights down a bit? Because these slides don't really show with a lot of backlighting. They're a little harder to read. Well, let me stand back a second. The first thing I want to say is that I'm going to try to give you a little overview of what led up to the War of 1812, and it started in 1793, so it's a long period. And some terms. We had two parties that started in the second term of Washington. The Federalist, which basically disappeared at about the War of 1812, which in my view, I call them the party by the 10% for the 10%. And then we had the party of Jefferson, which gets called variously the Democratic Republican or Republican Party. So I'm going to use its current name, which is the Democratic Party. It's just so that people don't get confused with people saying Republican Party, which has absolutely nothing to do with the Republican Party today. Now we'll start out. This is a quick kind of two-slide view presentation on what the overview was. In early 1793, France declared war on Great Britain, Holland, and Spain. They've been at war with other countries in Europe before that. But this is the first time Britain got involved. And at this time, this was the very beginning of Washington's first term. In fact, he had no more than gotten home to Mount Vernon after his inauguration when he had to come back to Washington to deal with the first crises involved in this war. I didn't bother with that one because it's relatively minor. But he had to do an emergency trip back. The other thing is, the US government really was only 4 years old under the Constitution. And the Constitution, if you read it, you can read it in about 20 minutes. And it's really more of an outline of a government, not a description of how you do it. And working out how you do it went on for the next 20 years. Things like the Supreme Court had no defined function. We were supposed to have a judiciary, but it wasn't defined until Marshall became Chief Justice. And it was defined by precedents. And by department, they were working out how this was going on. What involved the US was a simple fact: we were a granary. 85% of the population was farmers, and we produced excess food. Both Britain and all of the countries on Europe put tremendous numbers of men in the army and had trouble just producing enough food to feed everybody. So they needed the food that the US had. The trouble was they wanted to deprive their enemy of that food. So each one of them wanted as much as they could get from the US, but wanted to keep it from the other side. And this basically resulted in some pretty nasty economic warfare towards the end. But this is what got us involved. On top of that, the British wanted to control all the shipping, which also caused grief for many of our ships. Now, 2 times the US got pushed to the brink of war. Once with the British and once with the French. It was early on, before 1800. The states, which before the Constitution had pretty much, many of them have been acting like their own separate governments. Really, the Union wasn't very strong at that time. And none of them liked to pay any money. So a war was something that it was probably going to be difficult to pay for and might very well cause a breakup of the Union, particularly that early. And in both times, Washington once and Adams once, at the very last minute, they initiated peace negotiations that managed to keep us out of war. And from the beginning to 1812, for 19 years, we went from crisis to crisis to crisis, somehow maneuvered our way through it and stayed out of war. On June 18th, 1812, which is the day Congress passed the bill, President Madison and the Congress had run out of patience, and they declared war on Britain. And that's what we're going to talk about. Now, one of the big issues in this whole thing has been impressment. Impressment was not designed to annoy the U.S. It was the way the British Navy worked. In peacetime, they kept the ships in what they called ordinary, which meant they didn't have them manned, but did enough maintenance to keep them ready so that should they go to war, which seemed to happen every 10 to 20 years over there, they could bring the ships out, call up the officers who were on half pay, and get sailors. Now, the sailors, there was no career path for a sailor in the British Navy. So you had to go grab them however you could, and then get them to stay in the Navy, which was a really hard task. Now, the British Navy was crewed by what, and I've on purpose put volunteers in quotes, because very, very few people actually volunteered. The other half were impressed. And volunteers typically chose the Navy. One of the ones was you got in debt. And your choice was go to debtor's prison or go to the Navy. If you signed up, you got 2 months signing bonus, and you were in the Navy, but at least you weren't in debtor's prison, and they in fact would forgive something like 40 pounds of your debt, which for many people, the poorer people, was not a bad deal. Now here's kind of a cartoon of what impressment at sea looked like. They'd stop a ship, a British warship would stop a ship, go on board, and pick out some small number of men. Now most of this was done on British ships, not on American ships, by far. They would pick number, and there were a bunch of rules. They weren't supposed to take too many so that the ship couldn't make port, and they typically did it when the ship was coming in, which made people who've been on 2- and 3-year voyages really unhappy with this. Sailors universally hated impressment in every Navy. The British themselves did not like it. Now, the British merchant sailor didn't really want to sail and serve in the Navy. The pay was poor. It was slow in coming. They delay it at least 6 months and many times a year to try to make you stay on board to get paid. The conditions on those ships, which were very crowded, were hard and not pleasant. And their discipline was harsh. They flogged for just minor offenses. Desertion, volunteer or impressed, was around 25%. So the British Navy was chronically short of manpower all the time. They were always looking. Now the British sailors who went into Britain were virtually guaranteed sooner or later to get impressed. So they started looking for other places they could go. And here was the U.S. with a merchant marine that was expanding like crazy. And yes, you might get impressed, but your chances were a lot better in the U.S. Merchant Marine than they were in the British Merchant Marine. And a large number of British sailors served on U.S. ships.
These commercial or military ships?
These are plain old merchant, commercial merchant ships. I've seen one of the problems you run into in all of this is nobody really knows what any of the numbers were. I've seen numbers over 10,000 British sailors serving in the U.S. Merchant Marine. It got more confusing because the U.S. citizenship requirements were pretty loose, and the British defined it as anybody who was born in Britain. So it got fairly confusing. And there were no records, so no one really knows. But the impressment from the U.S. was really an offshoot of the impressment they were doing in the British Merchant Marine, which is their commercial shipping. Okay, we had our first major crisis, which was called the Jay Treaty. Now, in 1793, which is just after the war started, Britain issued an order in council. Now, an order in council is like a presidential order. It was a committee would go to the king. They'd make up an order of what should be done. They'd go to the king, have him sign it, and it would be called an order in council. Our equivalent is a presidential order. It's not approved by Congress, but it's an order that has the effect of law. In this case, they started to, because of that order, capture U.S. merchant ships that were going into French ports, particularly in the Caribbean. In the spring of 1794, over 250, and these numbers you'll find anywhere from 250 to 500, they're all over the place depending on the source you go to. So I just picked a number that I thought was reasonable. But you will, as you look in various places, you'll get various numbers. And of those 250, 150 were condemned, which meant that they were seized and their cargo sold off. So they were gone. Now, the public was not really happy with this. They wanted war. There was only one problem. War with Britain, when you had absolutely no navy and you sold your last warship in 1785, really wasn't a great idea. So, at a last resort, Washington sent his Chief Justice, John Jay, to Britain to basically negotiate a trade treaty and get whatever he could get. And the British didn't give him a lot. The treaty was not what the public wanted. It took an awful lot of arm twisting and threatening to get it through Congress, but it passed through Congress. And the result was 10 years of relative peace. There was never even ever total peace, but at least you weren't being preyed upon constantly by the British. Now, Mr. Jay wasn't dumb. He realized that once all of this became public, he was going to be persona non grata, so he went and got himself elected governor of New York and was well clear, because if the Congress had had their choice, they would have impeached him as Chief Justice. He made a statement, "I could walk from one end of this country to the other by the light of the fires of me being burned in effigy." But pretty quickly things quieted down and we went on. Now here's kind of a local note. This is what happens and what you would see. This happens to be a note that I found in the Orrin papers. It's a Marbleheader. It says, Marblehead, July the 5th, 1794. This is to certify that James Trefry had on board the schooner Edward 10 quintals of Jamaica codfish, and the said schooner was taken by the Spanish, and his cargo was condemned in the port of Havana. Myself, master at that time, John Anson. So Marblehead ships were being taken. This is the real thing of the time. Oops. The QuasiWar. The problem is when we signed the Jay Treaty, the French Directorate, which was the revolutionary French government, interpreted it as an alliance between Britain and the US. They didn't like that. So they then proceeded to issue letters of marque to privateers to take US merchant shipping, and they also had many of the naval ships raiding US commerce. By the spring of 1797, about 300 ships had been taken. Again, this is one of those where you get all kinds of numbers. I've seen numbers as large as 1,000. At this point, the president appointed a 3-man committee. Pinckney was already in Europe as an ambassador. Marshall and Gary was basically Adams's man. This was in the Adams administration. Gary was Adams's man to negotiate with France. The French wouldn't even receive the mission in the country. They wouldn't recognize them. Then there was the XYZ affair, which is a complicated affair and takes several pages to explain in a book. And it boiled down to attempts at coercion of loans and bribery. And explaining it all really doesn't matter, because the fact is the US was treated like a fourth world country, and they didn't like it. And in March 1798, the dispatches arrived in Adams' hands telling him the mission had failed. And the way it had failed, as the month went on, came in, and he realized he was sitting on a time bomb. If it was released, the public was going to demand war. And turns out, after about a month, the House of Representatives passed a set of resolutions. By the way, information leaked then just like it does now. You couldn't keep anything secret. They passed a resolution requiring the president to provide them with the information. The Democrats voted for it along with the Federalists because they thought he was hiding something on the French side. When they got the papers and looked at it, the Democrats were stunned. Some of them were ready to go to war, and all of the Federalists were ready to go to war. Sam Sewell, who was from Marblehead, our representative, called on Congress to prepare for war. And boy, did the U.S. need a Navy. At that point, the U.S. naval forces consisted of 3 very nice, brand new frigates that were being fitted out, were not ready to go to sea, and a number of revenue cutters. That was it. None of them really, at that point, ready to take anybody on. The U.S. created a Department of the Navy, started purchasing merchant ships they thought would be suitable for arming as warships. They authorized new construction, quite a number of frigates, And they also had ships built by subscription, which meant a local group of well-to-do people, like here in Essex County, would get together. They would come up with the money to build a warship, build it, and the government would give them government bonds for it. It was a way of borrowing that the government didn't have to pay for right then and there. And one other big thing is they appropriated the money to build the frames for 6 74-gun ships of the line. If those ships had been built and were even being fitted out, what happened in the next 14 years wouldn't have happened. The British, no way were going to hazard their ships if there was any chance of, these were the battleships of their period. They were going to, if they got involved with the U.S., they were going to have to send their major ships of the line over here. They couldn't send frigates and little 20-gun ships, which they did when we had nothing. They couldn't send any old ship over here because they always would have the threat of those things appearing. And this is the part that gets it called the QuasiWar. On July 7, 1798, Congress authorized attacks on armed French ships. It wasn't war, but it wasn't peace. But it was certainly Congress authorized, and I can point out that since World War II, the U.S. has never declared war. Every war that we have fought in has been basically done this way, by some kind of a congressional authorization, not by an act of war. So this is not unusual. By the summer of 1700, the U.S. had 50 ships and 5,000 sailors. They had the organization to support them, and they were already, as soon as the ships were available, sending them to the Caribbean and putting them into battle. Here we have one of the first 3 frigates, the Constellation, which was originally called a 36-gun. The number in parentheses is the number of guns, and was re-rated as a 38 since it was a very large 36, versus the Insurgent of the French, which had 40 guns, which however were smaller guns. And in 1799, the Constellation defeated the Insurgent, captured her, and she was inducted into the U.S. Navy and served until she was lost in a storm. This was not at all unusual, by the way. The Guerrière was a French ship that the British had captured, repaired, and sent out to sea. Armed navies were capturing ships from other navies and using them as their own. The designs of ships didn't change significantly for over 100 years. So you could easily take one of your opponent's ships and turn it into your own use. Now, this is the part that most people have trouble with and goes on in most wars. It's the parallel track. At the same time you're going to war, you're negotiating peace. In this case, only 2 of the people on the commission came back right away. Elbridge Gerry, much to the damage to his reputation, was asked by the French foreign minister, Talleyrand, to stay behind. He did. And in the time as it went by, it became clear the French really didn't want to go to war with us. Although we were prepared for war, they weren't really interested in going to war. So a second mission was made up of 3 people, which, other than the Chief Justice, none of which you would know, and they began negotiations in 1799. It took a very long time, almost 9 months, between the time Adams announced this and the time that they actually issued the instructions and sent the men over. That was because of one Timothy Pickering of Salem, who was dragging his feet. He was Secretary of State and wanted war with France And basically Adams waited him out. He was a holdover from the Washington administration, and soon thereafter Adams got rid of him. Finally, on September 30th, 1800, a peace treaty was signed with Napoleon. As usual, when you signed with a major power, you didn't get a heck of a lot, but you got something, and you didn't get yourself in war. And on February 18th, the lame duck Congress, elections were then held by a totally different system than we do today. So the president was inaugurated in the middle of March. So this was a lame duck Congress at the end of their term. They ratified the treaty. It turned out in that election of 1800 that the Democrats won the majority in both houses. And that led to this. The Federalists, who had dominated the lame duck Congress, realized there was going to be a cut in the Navy. So they decided to try to get ahead of it and save as much of the Navy as they could. So they placed much of the Navy in storage, sold off the ones, for instance, they had bought commercial ships and tried to convert them, and some of them didn't work out, sold off the ones they could, and discharged many of the sailors. The Democrats, who were really, really pinching pennies, it wasn't good enough. In 1803, they reduced the Navy to 13 frigates and only 6 were deployed. And that was to support 3 frigates in the Mediterranean to fight what was called the Barbary Wars. It took 5 years to do that because they never sent enough force over there to really get the job done. Until 1812, the little bit of money, and it was as little as they could get away with, went to building 160 to 180 gunboats for harbor defense. They were totally useless. Most of them had guns mounted on them that were too big for the ships, and they couldn't stand the recoil of the gun. And worse, their crews were relatively small, and the British could capture them with boat attacks. In fact, in New Orleans, 6 of them, in the Battle of New Orleans, 6 of them that participated were all captured by British longboat attacks. They just didn't have enough men to fight off them. They also bought a few small warships, and they put minimum maintenance on the existing fleet. The ones that were in storage, all of them needed major repairs, and some of them were beyond economical. At least 2 of them were beyond economical repairs. So the 7 they had put in storage, for all intents and purposes, were at the beginning of 1812 unavailable and not likely to be available in any reasonable period of time. So the result was we in reality had 6 top-line ships left. This is a typical one of these gunboats, which you never see a painting of because they were small. This is a 50-footer. They were 50 to 70 foot long. They carried 1 to 2 guns. This happens to be a 2-gun version. Obviously, they did not fire straight fore and aft, or there wouldn't be any mast or any rigging. They were mounted on kind of a turret mechanism that you moved by hand, and you could fire maybe 30 degrees on either side. If you ever fired broadside, 50-50, the ship rolled over. So, but they were cheap. And there's actually a book on Jefferson's Gunboat Navy, which you can get if you're interested. Now, Jefferson got lucky. He was definitely wanted an administration of extreme economy. This for a man who was in debt up to his eyeballs. In order to pay for the ships, a tax on whiskey had been put on and a land tax was put on. And the Westerners and the Southerners of the Democratic Party absolutely hated it. Most of the government funds before that had come from duties, which was coming in on ships that were going through New England, New York, and Philadelphia. So there was a major cutback in what was spent. They did keep the Mediterranean squadron manned, and pretty much through 1807, 1808. However, in 1803, a big event occurred. Napoleon had gotten the port of New Orleans and some relatively undefined chunk of land from the Spanish. When he first got it in 1801, he was thinking of trying to set up a colony over here. He got disabused of that idea, and when he sent a bunch of soldiers to Haiti to suppress a slave revolt, and had, between guerrilla warfare and disease, lost 2/3 of the people he sent. He decided maybe it wasn't, and on top of that he had the British Navy. He thought maybe he wasn't such a great idea. And he offered it to the US for $15 million. And this is a thing, everyone has talked great about the Louisiana Purchase. Number one, there was nothing in the Constitution about the US ever buying land. So it was probably unconstitutional, but nobody bothered to ask. And on top of that, the title, the way the French had got it from the Spanish, the title was not exactly really good. But the one thing that mattered was the US had lots of immigrants coming in. The river steamboat got developed at about that time, and we settled it. And boots on the ground win every time, in case we had a title and we had the people to put on the ground, and as a result, we ended up claiming a large amount of land. And French used this money as part of the money to get ready to invade Britain. This is the land of Louisiana Purchase. Other than the area around in Louisiana, the rest of it was pretty ill-defined. Its one border was the Mississippi River, and the rest of it was, now it's been defined, but back then pretty loosely defined. But we got it, and as a result, we nearly doubled the size of the country. It's amazing the amount of controversy there was over it at the time. However, it went through, got passed, and we doubled the size of the country. This in the middle of that war. Now, the first term, I guess I should step back on the last item. When the French prepared to invade Britain, for the next 2 years, Britain and France were right next to each other. France was building literally 2,000 ships, small barges, to row across the channel to try to get 100,000 men on British soil. If they could do that, they would have won, they would have taken Britain, and that would have been the last of their opposition with Britain. And this kept the British all tied up, and there wasn't too much trouble then. However, finally on October 1805, Britain won the Battle of Trafalgar, and they gained sea supremacy. At that point, French, who didn't really have a credible option with their navy, decided on a trade war. The continent, which the French then controlled most of, was forbidden to trade with England, and that was about half of England's trade. England was basically the manufacturer of the world at that time. They were way ahead in the Industrial Revolution. So the British retaliated with a blockade of France. Unfortunately, if you're neutral, you're caught between the two people who are warring, both of which will buy from you, both of which make it extremely difficult for you to do anything with the other guy. For instance, if you stopped in a British port and went to France, your ship was seized. If you didn't stop in a British port, the British would seize you for trying to run the blockade. That was a great catch-22. In 1806, Jefferson realized he had to do something, and he sent Monroe and Pinckney to Britain to attempt to negotiate a treaty as Washington had. He actually got a treaty that was better than the one Washington had got, but it didn't prohibit impressment, which the Royal Navy was never going to allow, because the minute you created a place where the merchant sailors could go without impressment, they were going to go there in large numbers. So they would not give on that, and as a result, Jefferson never presented the treaty to the Senate. All of that's nice if you're willing to go back it up and build yourself some ships. If you don't, get prepared for some bad news. And the bad news came in the Chesapeake-Leopard affair. Impressment, one of the places you were safest if you were a British sailor was to get on a U.S. warship. And they did. We would say they were U.S. citizens, but it was not hard to get papers that said you were a U.S. citizen. There weren't, you had to be born in this country, but then again, the only birth records were baptismal records, and that was for people who went to church. So many people had zero records of that they were born in this country. So it wasn't very hard for you to come up with papers. The result, the British paid no attention to papers. They'd look at the men and decide whether they were British or not, and they'd impress the ones they believed were British. Or sometimes, if they were really tight for men, they'd grab anybody. However, they'd never touched a U.S. warship. A British vice admiral gave orders to the Leopard to search the Chesapeake for deserters. On June 22nd, 1807, the Chesapeake left Norfolk for the Mediterranean station, obviously with a new crew, not really prepared for much of anything. The decks were not cleared for action. She still had cargo on board from some people she was carrying across. As she went out to sea, the Leopard intercepted her and asked for a courtesy visit on the pretense of asking them to carry some mail over across the ocean, which was not unusual at that time. They sent a longboat over. And the demand that was handed the captain of the Chesapeake was that he was to muster the crew so the British could search him for deserters. That was one thing in his orders he was told not to do. But knowing he had a much superior ship on the other side, he didn't really give him a straight answer. However, the longboat went back to the Leopard. The Leopard dropped her gun ports, ran out her guns, and at that point fired one warning shot across the bow, quickly fired by 3 broadsides, killed 3 and wounded 17. And the Chesapeake captain was really, in fact, he was banned from the Navy for 5 years for not having his ship ready for action. He surrendered the ship because he really didn't have any other choice. The Leopard, which was a 50-gunner, could have literally taken the ship apart. Jefferson tried diplomacy, demanded an apology and return of the deserters. British paid no attention like they had normally. Finally, on July 2nd, he tried closing U.S. waters to British ships. Didn't really have much effect. And to even rub a little more salt into the wound, the king signed an order in council in 1807 that really made the conditions for going anywhere near Britain or a British port really tough. And it increased impressment significantly. There's kind of a picture of the longboat making a visit just before the Leopard opened fire. Now this was about as close to an act of war as you could come. But Jefferson had no military. His navy was virtually nil. He had a few thousand in the army. So his only choice was an economic response. And every country that's tried an economic response has to think very carefully, because an economic response has the potential of damaging you more than your enemy. But in any case, they passed an embargo law which banned any U.S. ship from going out on the ocean, period. This idle sailors, shoremen, unemployed, left goods to rot. The farmers who'd been planning to sell their produce found out there was no way to get it anywhere. They were just left with it. It caused a depression in New England, lots of problems in the rest of the country, and some of the shippers started to try to evade it with smuggling. So they then passed more laws trying to make the penalty for violating the act worse. That just made things worse. This is a political cartoon of the time. Now the one on the left is Jefferson. The snapping turtle is because the snapping turtle never lets go. And, oh, grab me is embargo spelled backwards. This was probably a New England or New York cartoon. They did not like the embargo, and they made it painfully clear they did not like the embargo. And one thing that really gets politicians' attention is watching the other party do well. In the election of 1808, the Federalist support went up because the Federalists were the ones for free trade, and they did not want any limits from their own government. So, just before Jefferson left office, the Embargo Act was repealed, and they put in a Non-Intercourse Act. It only forbade trade with Britain, France, and their possessions. It was easier to get around because they'd been getting around various restrictions for years, but still it hurt. And New England felt that, and by the way, New England had a separatist movement going from the early 1800s. Various times it pops up as things get tough, but New England and at times parts of New York had rumors of threats of separation from the country or secession. It never went anywhere, but it was always rolled out whenever things really went against them. And Madison just continued on with Jefferson's policy. Except halfway through his term, he stopped building those silly gunboats. They tried, in 1810, they tried another bill to try to get the British and France to remove their trade restrictions. There was a bunch of diplomatic exchanges and whatever, and when it was all over, it had failed. Nothing had happened. But all we did was make bad relations worse with Britain. Now, here we have what you see in that period. This is an ambassador's protest to the capture of a couple of schooners from Marblehead that were caught trying to run the British blockade to go to Bordeaux. If you can read it, I won't bother to read it to you. If you would like me to, I can read what's on it. But this is the official response. Never could find what the result was, but my suspicion is absolutely nothing was done. But it made the dispatches. These were brought in. And by the way, there were lots of these. There's a website just loaded with all this correspondence that was going on back and forth across the Atlantic, the stuff that went to Congress from the president. We had one war incident before we get to the point where war is getting really imminent. The president was one of the 44-gun original frigates. And it turns out that the Guerriere had taken and pressed a seaman from Maine, and they were asked to go investigate. They saw a ship in front of them at a good distance, tried to identify it, and it didn't fly identification colors, nor did they. So the result was she chased the ship, and from the angle she got, she estimated her at a lot bigger ship than she was. She was in fact the little belt of 20 guns. The president finally caught up with a little belt at night, a little after 8 o'clock, and anyone who's been to sea at night knows that estimating distances and sizes is extremely difficult. Both of the ships approached each other. Both of them had their guns run out, charged and ready to fire, and somebody on one of them, and they argued forever about who did it, fired a gun. And that's all it took. Both of them just fired everything they had. And about 2 or 3 broadsides, the president had virtually demolished the little belt. When they'd realized what happened, they offered aid, which the British refused, and they somehow managed to get her to Halifax and repair her. However, as kind of a note, the Guerriere put on her main topsail, "We're not the little belt." Not a good prophecy. They were to meet a similar fate, actually a worse fate, a little more than a year from then. Now we come to war. All this economic war that had gone on between Europe, the US, France, the continent, and England had finally just virtually stopped all trade. The British had merchant ships. There was nobody who would accept them. No one else was allowed to go there. The problem was their goods were just piling up in warehouses. They had to let men go. Pretty soon they had a major depression on their hands. Certainly a lot worse than anything we've got now. People were literally starving. The government generally in Britain at that time didn't pay a lot of attention to the people, but they did pay attention to the fellows who had the money, the merchants, who had all of these goods in warehouses and couldn't move them anywhere. So finally, on April 21, this was a big break in what Britain had been doing. They announced a conditional repeal of the Orders in Council. The condition was that the French lift their restrictions. Right after this, when leaving a meeting that was discussing the Orders in Council, the British Prime Minister was assassinated by someone who had a grudge against the government, nothing to do with this. By the way, he's the only British Prime Minister who's ever been assassinated. He was a hardliner, and his removal was fairly key in what was to happen. On May 20th, one of the U.S. diplomats in London, the charge d'affaires, gave evidence to the British that the French had revoked their decrees for the U.S. They had a couple of decrees named for various cities, one of them being the Berlin Decree, that were part of this economic warfare. So they were going to let the U.S. in. And from the British point of view, if the U.S. could get into France and they let them into Britain, they could carry British goods from Britain to France, and that would break their problem. Unfortunately, news at that point took anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks to cross the Atlantic from Britain to the U.S. So while all this is going on in April and May, the U.S. has no idea. Madison got nominated in early May for his second term. And on the 1st of June, he sent what amounted to a war message to Congress. Didn't actually ask them to declare war, but it all but did. He felt he shouldn't actually ask them to declare war. Before Congress had done anything, the dispatches on the fact that British were apparently changing their policy started arriving. Surprisingly, nothing was done. And on June 18th, Congress passed the act of war. And it wasn't really an overwhelming vote. 79 to 49 in the House, 19 to 13 in the Senate, and absolutely none of the Federalists, who were all from New England, voted for it. And the next day, the President signed the Declaration. The new British Prime Minister was a Lord Liverpool. They said more practical. He basically wanted to get those goods moving, so that Britain started getting some money in. On the 23rd of June, which was 4 days after we had declared war on England, England repealed the orders in council that were causing us to not be able to go into Britain. The next day, Napoleon invaded Russia. This certainly got the British attention, because I seriously doubt there was anyone in England who believed that that Napoleon was going to lose a whole army. At the point all the news they were getting was he was just rolling over the Russians, just going into the country. 500,000 men, and if he succeeded, they were going to be next on the list. So they were not much interested in starting a war with a country 3,000 miles away, even if they didn't have very much of a navy or an armed forces. Tying up your force of 3,000 miles from home when you might be facing a fight for the country's life was not a great idea. We had the British in a position where they were willing to, for once in their lives, give. When Madison, even though we're at war, rushed a mission to Britain. The Britons took the position that you'd kind of expect them to do. They had repealed the orders, and the U.S. could take it as is and go make a barrel of money, but they were not going to give up the right to reimpose the orders should things with France get really bad, and they were not going to stop impressment as long as they had to staff their navy. And as far as Madison was concerned, that was insufficient to try to end the war. And the British waited quite a while. They knew we had declared war near the end of July, and they waited till the middle of October before they finally issued an order in council for British forces to enter the war. This sure says they were looking, it appears they were looking for peace and giving us every chance to do it. The most interesting thing is that the two issues that we said were most important on declaring war benefited the area in the country that was absolutely violently opposed to going to war. Those two issues would benefit New England and the ports. Those were all violently opposed. It's somewhat perplexing as to exactly whether this was an excuse to do some other things or what. But when one looks into it, it gets to be something I suspect scholars, if I get to look at various books, will have different opinions on exactly what was going on. But like it or not, we were in war. And the opponents call it Mr. Madison's War, which from all in looks, it really was. And here's Mr. Madison in his prime. He was a short gentleman, and by the time 1812, he was 61 years old, and his description was a wizened old man. He'd aged badly. His wife, Dolly, which all of you have heard of, was 17 years younger than him, and pretty much in her prime, so she got a lot of credit. He didn't. As far as New England, 5 years of harassment from their own government, in addition to what they were getting from the British and French, didn't make New England happy. They knew that it was going to even be worse if we went to war, and they opposed it. Massachusetts governor, who was a Federalist, named Caleb Strong, and another veteran of the Revolution. He was in his early 70s, along with a lot of the other veterans of the Revolution. He gave a message opposing the war to the Massachusetts House of Representatives about a week after war was declared. The message refuted the reasons for declaration, but encouraged the citizens to do their duty. He didn't say, don't do anything, fight this. He still stayed in the Union. And one of the more important things is all of the Northeast banks refused to lend to the national government. And the national government the year before had let the charter on the Bank of the United States expire, resulting in they didn't have any way to raise money. Now at this point, can we raise the lights? I'll give you an idea of how the opposition was in New England. This is a little pamphlet which was put out in 1812 by the state to send around. And I'm going to read it. I retyped them because it's a little difficult to read in that size print. It's, by the way, going to be on the website, Marblehead Museum website. Here are a couple of excerpts from that. In regard to the impressment of our seamen, the British government have at no period pretended to the right of taking them, knowing them to be such. They claim the right of visiting neutral ships in search of their own subjects, and in exercises of it, abuses, though to a much less extent than people have been led to believe, have been practiced. But the conclusive remark on this subject is that Mr. Monroe, now Secretary of State, and Mr. Pinckney, the present Attorney General, had made an arrangement with the British government for the protection of our seamen, which in their judgment would be perfectly competent to that object. But that this arrangement, President Jefferson, evidently and fatally determined to preserve every irritation, refused to confirm. Since the British government has always professed a willingness to enter upon new arrangements, their minister has lately explicitly offered to obtain the restoration of every American seaman upon being furnished a list of them. We cannot add, but add, the Senate of the Commonwealth has refused to concur with the House in the means of procuring from every town a list of their citizens, the number of which we have reason to believe would be quite considerable in comparison with the exaggerated allegations of our administration, as well as those who by this act of their government are now exposed to capture and confinement in prison ships. The House at that time was Federalist, the Senate was Democratic, and the Democrats didn't want to find out for sure exactly how many people had been impressed because nobody really knew. Here's another excerpt. It is by these means, fellow citizens, in our apprehension that you are now involved in war. The event forms a new era in our national history. It is an event awful, unexpected, hostile to your interest, menacing to your liberties, and revolting to your feelings. It destroys your confidence in the protection which the Constitution intended to afford against all wars repugnant to the interests and will of the people, and proves that your Congress is in greater subjugation to the executive influence and to the passions of the few than the ascendancy of the dispassionate councils. But your duties are great in proportion to the magnitude of the exigency and the trial upon your fortitude and patriotism. Finally, fellow citizens, we are constrained to declare our opinion that war under the present circumstances is a wanton sacrifice of your best interests, and that the provocation is not adequate to this highest and most signal act of vengeance. That it were ever so, it ought not to be taken without greater preparation. And that the declaration in war is in fact a commission from our government to the British cruisers to seize that portion of our commercial capital which has hitherto escaped the aggressions of foreign nations and the no less fatal measures of our government. Doesn't sound like they were real happy. And there's more of similar ilk in this paper, which is a 13.5-page affair. There are two of them that I have, one which is in the museum collection, one which I have here. For some reason, I have not seen any of these on the web. Well, at this point, I finished my prepared material.